Africans in Harlem, African in Harlem, so what can be said? First thing I will say, I will start by what got me interested in this topic, because we always, as scholars, talk about objectivity, but everything said by subjectivity, what got you interested. So we'll start with the first slide, please. Yeah, the next one. Thank you. Thank you. So how I came to this project? I moved to Harlem in 2015 from Boston. And when I got to Harlem, I experienced a completely different and nuanced neighborhood. Yes, because from outside Harlem, the narrative and also the representation of Harlem in our collective imaginary, it's about African American, and rightfully so. But you come to Harlem, you see how diverse it is. And for me, the idea of a book was birthed in a fall afternoon while I was preparing material for my classes in a cafe known as Madiba. So everybody knows Nelson Mandela. So it's right next to the African market, which is named after Malcolm X. So I was sitting in the cafe, having my little cafe and working on my computer. And as you are all aware, in New York, you have these, tour buses, kind of double decker, and one just pull up on the opposite of the street. So visitors start streaming in the cafe to get beverages. And I was sitting there and I heard this woman on her phone saying, I am on the Jewish history tour of Harlem. And I was thinking to myself, I've been here for almost 4 months and I see a lot of African presence in this space. And I was thinking, is there any African tour of Harlem or even African history tour of Harlem? Can I create one? Automatically I Google and I'm like, oops, I cannot, because CUNY, contract say that, okay, if you are full-time employee, you cannot have a side job. So I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to start to document this for my personal information, because coming into Harlem, I heard about, and I also in elementary school, not elementary school, secondary school, in literature classes, the Harlem Renaissance. That I'm very familiar with. But the African moving to Harlem, okay, out of all the neighborhoods in New York City, why in Harlem? So that's how I started documenting this on my book and in my computer. And then from that, it evolved to something larger. Why something larger? Because I kept talking to people around me about this interest. And my then director of Black Studies program said, hey, Boukary, why wouldn't you just, put together a class on Africans in Harlem? I'm like, sure. So I started this class, and that class went on for 3 years. And then the English department, the MFA program, got in touch with me and said, hey, can you, we heard that your class is very popular. Can you teach Africa in Harlem class for our MFA students, which they will go on to be, writers. So I, taught that class. And I continued, with my book, and I got the contract and kept, the revisions. So that's how I came to this project. And I can say that, okay, this project has a kind of an outgrowth. The outgrowth now is, I'm working on, it's already, almost done on the African tour of Harlem. So it's kind of circling back. So this is how I got to this project. And then, okay, how to approach it. So the research methods are archival research. And archival research, the first is the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. And I will say it's one of the most rich repository when it comes to Black culture worldwide. It's not only the US. And I dare to claim that before the opening of the African American Museum in DC, this one is #1 in the country, in the US. And also in terms of archival research, you have the Michigan State University that has an archive on the African Militant Archive. So very rich when it comes to the civil rights movement, the intersection between Africa and the diaspora, and also the anti-apartheid movement at the time. And also I should mention here churches. You have the Riverside Church that has what they call the South Africa task force, because the church has been very active during the Free South Africa movement and also post-apartheid, very active. And then you have oral stories. Oral stories, I will, I've interviewed leaders in the communities to ask about what was Harlem then, Harlem you knew, and Harlem today. And that I was angling toward gentrification, which is one of the challenges in Harlem right now. And obviously the global Harlem courses that are taught in the Black Studies program, but also in the English program, in the English MFA program. And then you have, I started accumulating data. And the question is, what is my approach? My approach is mostly qualitative or quantitative. Why? Because you have few data on Africans, immigrants. So it's not that specific. So you have the American Community Survey that's, have data. You have the US Census, but the US Census only give you as far as Black, that's it. But in terms of immigration status, no. And then you have the Harlem community discussion groups. And here I should mention Rashida Ismaili, who has been generous enough because she ran an African literary salon in Harlem. And she's originally from Benin, and she's been living in Harlem since 1957. So she's the matriarch. She knows African, history in Harlem inside out. Why the title of the book, Africans in Harlem, an Untold New York Story? Because that speaks to the larger point of African immigration in the US, which is something that is almost untold. Why? Because you have African economic migration to America that started very late. It's the 80s, from the 80s to the early 90s. Why? Because this you have to go back to, if you make the connection to right now, we have the energy crisis. You have to make the connection to the late 1970s with the oil crisis. And then economies, took a downturn, and Europe started to toughen the entry and stay of immigrants. And you will see a rerouting of international migration where Africans, migrants here, when I say here, I'm talking to Western Europe, start going to America. And the first, for New York, the first African immigrants in New York will be the Senegalese, the Malian, the Guinean, and then later you will see the Ivorians, and then the Burkinabe. I'm talking about Harlem. And in this, I should also add that in the US, 3/4 of African immigrants came from the 2000 onward. So it's really within the last it's not even a quarter of a century. So the last 20 years, 22 years. So it's pretty recent. So, and when we talk about Black immigrants in the US, mostly they come mostly from the Caribbean. And then, from the, after the Caribbean, you have Africans. So I give you, in 2019, you have 144,000 people who had been admitted from the Caribbean. I'm talking legally, and Africans were 92,000. I'm giving you here the official number, not what they call the undocumented, those who overstayed by visa, but those who came into the country illegally. Well, legally, everybody comes to the country legally, not everybody, but almost. You have and then the second reason, public debates and rhetoric on immigration in the US, which tend to be focused on the southern border crossings, and sometimes the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding there, or the southern state reaction to that. So that's tend to fuel the national debate and rhetoric about immigration, to the point that when you talk about African immigrants, who knows them? They're non-existent. And then you have the attention to other diasporic communities when it comes to research, when it comes to media. So you have South Asians, you have Jews, you have Chinese, but African diaspora in the US, nobody talks about them. And yet you have enclaves. If I take Atlanta alone, you have more than 10,000 Ivorians. If you take Houston has, almost close to, 100,000 or even more. If you take places like Maryland, it has one of the highest concentrations of Cameroonians in the US. I think those are, the studies that need to be done, because if you take the case of Houston, you'll say, okay, you have the oil industry in Nigeria and then Houston. But if you take Maryland and Cameroon, you have to scratch your head first and say exactly what's going on. And then yet, the number of Sub-Saharan African immigrants double every 10 years to reach 2 million in 2019, officially. And I shall also give how important, they are to the US economy, because in 2015, Sub-Saharan African immigrants has contributed $55.1 billion to the US economy, of which $10 billion went to federal taxes, and $4+ billion went to state taxes. And then they had more than $40 billion as spending power. So, but what is interesting here, we see that economic power doesn't equate to political representation or political power. And that we can, why, that's one of my, one of the topics that I like to develop a lot in the community. Say, maybe the next step will be move into local politics, maybe council member or something. Yes. Thank you. And then, okay, what are the African legal immigration pathways to America? So might sound the same to here. The first one is a family reunification. We have the green card or diversification or diversity lottery. You have employment-based visa holders and refugee settlement and asylum seekers. Those are the 4 pathways. And for refugee settlement, I should point out that here that the Ethiopians are the first one to come in large number when it comes to refugee settlement in the US. I know we talk, usually it's the Somali that stays in people's mind, but it's the Ethiopians. When in the late 70s, you have the Haile Mengistu, dictatorial regime, so many fled. Okay, that was, kind of setting up, the context. Now Africans in Harlem. So Africans in Harlem looks like this, enclave, um, Burkina Land. Maybe I'm a little bit chauvinistic because I'm original from Burkina Faso, and then little Senegal. So Burkina Land is on Adam Clinton Powell Boulevard between 133rd and 143rd, because it's a residential but also a commercial venue, to the point that for all Burkinabe officials, I'm talking about ministers, if you are on a governmental business to the US and you come to New York, yeah, you go to the U and you do your business thing, but you have to come uptown. If not, you haven't come to New York. The community haven't seen you, and nobody hasn't seen you. So, and what's interesting here, you have a shrine, music venue. It used to be a Black Panther Party office. And right across, we could not see it from this picture, but right across it, you have the Waka Sports Bar, which used to be a jazz club dating back to the 1920s and 30s. So where you had Billie Holiday that performed. So it's very interesting how you have these spaces with a rich African-American history, and then you have Africans that comes and breathed a new life into those spaces. That's where we have kind of the meeting, the encounters and exchanges between the two. And then we have Little Senegal, which is the first and the most well-known space, which is on 116 between Adam Clinton, between Lennox and Frederick Douglass. So from left to right, these are Senegalese stores and residential areas. And I walk down these streets a lot because doing interviews, and we've been there since, for many of them, since the late 90s, the late 80s. And how, in terms of the makeup, the first immigrants were bachelors, were singles, single men who came and then later they will bring their wives. And I was mentioning earlier about gentrification. One of the, I don't want to say sad, but one of the challenge for this community, for me, is how almost none of them, I can, from all the people that I interview, none of them own a piece of land, or none of them own an apartment or even a storefront there. Yet they've been there for more than, since the late 80s and early 90s. So which means that if rent keep going up to the point that it's not, it's insurmountable, they will have to leave. That's the, I'm saying this because we've seen other restaurants in that space in here that's left because they could not keep up with rent, and they went to different place, but unfortunately the clientele is not there. But coming back also is very difficult because you cannot afford it. So I think that's one of the challenges for, not for Senegalese, but also for immigrants in general. Even myself, I'm asking myself, can the college professor afford to live in Harlem? Because a studio costs you $2,000. You cannot get a good studio under $2,000. No. So you have communities, but also you have businesses. And in terms of businesses, I'm giving here just, a salon, bars, cafes, and restaurants. And I should say, I will take one by one and give you some of the challenges and some of the opportunities. For a salon, it has been a business that has been booming for many years, but I think it has reached the kind of a saturation level where it is not as profitable as it used to be. And also in terms of encounters and exchanges, it's one of the places where you have Africans and African American coming together. And also as someone who's, okay, loves movies, it's one of the places where Nollywood was really exposed to the diaspora audience, where, okay, you come for your hair braiding and then watching, then there is Nollywood, a movie that is playing, or music videos from, okay, musician from Africa. So it's not only a place to get your hair done, but also we can call it a cultural center, okay, perform that space. But also right now, there is some tension. There was some tension because at one point you can open a salon, you can be a hairdresser without a license. And then, I think, okay, first, there was a license, and then, okay, they decide no license anymore. And then you have one group, I should say, African Americans, if I get in trouble, because that's how, okay, say, hey, you need more license to be a hairdresser. And then you have the majority of African hairdressers say you don't need it. So now there is a clash, but also there is a kind of lobbying on this issue. So it's interesting is how this is developing. And then bars, more and more, in Harlem, you have many African owned and run bars. And then some of the challenge for many analysts is that these bars or salons and restaurants, they create enclaves. When they create enclaves, not in the sense of a French when I say communautarism, but create enclaves where sometimes Africans, immigrants, don't feel the need to reach out beyond their own circles. And if they don't reach out beyond their own circle, that can lead to furthering misunderstanding or stereotypical view of each other. And then you have restaurants, plenty of African restaurants, which has changed the landscape in terms of culture in Harlem. And also in terms of culture, you have festivals in Harlem that's really, is not catered, but really are there because there is a large African community. You have a New York African Film Festival. You have the African Diaspora International Film Festival. You have my own festival, Harlem African Animation Festival. So in terms of culture, why? Because simply Harlem has this large French-speaking community in New York. You don't have that geographical location and concentration anywhere else in New York. Okay, I was ahead of myself. So here, and then also you have Congo in Harlem. Congo in Harlem is not only, it's a film festival, it's an arts festival, meaning that we have an exhibition, photography exhibition. They have also other artists that they invite. You have Africa Now Festival in the Apollo Theater, and then you have a performance of many musicians at the Apollo Theater. And just 3 weeks ago, Umu Sangare was at the Apollo Theater from Mali. And you have also places of worship, and you have a masjids, which how mosques are known in Harlem, and you have churches. And also you have places of Black and African spirituality in Harlem, but also a lot in Brooklyn. So I'm mentioning these places because it contributes to the encounter between Africans and African American. Why am I coming back to this? Because I get a lot of questions on what are the relations between Africans, immigrants, and African Americans. And I said, it's kind of meeting someone after 400 years. So obviously you have, misunderstanding, you have different historical and cultural reference that you have developed, but at the same time, we have a cyclical examples of solidarity. And then you have, in terms of businesses, you have traders and street vendors. And this is the one I was referencing. Malcolm Shaba's Harlem Market is known as, the African market. And the book cover draws from here. And it's on 116. The story about this market goes back to Mayor Giuliani. Mayor Giuliani, who was very tough on the, let's say, street vendors, was very tough. And on the Africans, vendors used to be mostly on 125th, and they were displaced, and they were able to navigate city politics and got this place. So, and for me, it's very interesting that most of them are, West Africans, and I would say most of them, what I don't want to say illiterate, but they were not formally educated in the Western system. I'm mentioning this because if you know, the politics of space in New York City, for these traders and merchants to be able to secure this place in Harlem, they're very, resilient and very entrepreneurial. And then, okay, on 125th, you see these kind of stalls on the sidewalks selling African crafts and arts items. And everything is not about business, but also it's about the community coming together around event, particularly the African American Parade Day, which is an outgrowth of the Indian Parade Day that, West Indians created in Harlem. And then, they moved to Brooklyn, and then they still continue that tradition in Brooklyn. So, and then you have the African American Parade Day, which I think the third Sunday or third weekend of September every year. And you see African Americans, you see Africans, you see the neighborhood in its all complexity coming together to celebrate the community and being together and the togetherness. Okay. Now I want to take you back, into history, because I've been talking about the African presence in Harlem with its cultural transformation since the 80s. But the connection between Harlem and Africa goes way more than that. So this is the historical part. We start with the African burial ground. I think that we're all familiar with the burial ground in Lower Manhattan, but the Harlem African burial ground just got discovered, not discovered, but came to the attention of policymakers, within the last 10 years. And prior to the COVID, there is a project that is aimed at building a cultural center and memorial. But the Harlem African burial, who are buried under the Bass Depot on 116, these were the first Africans to arrive what they call Harlem, which was then the Dutch village. We're talking here about the 17th century. And this, the story, I'll give you, the brief background story here. It was a cemetery. A cemetery was run by a Dutch church. There were two separate cemeteries for Black and for whites. And then when this church decided to move to the Bronx, they took the whites, they deterred them and went with it. And the Blacks, the slaves stayed there. And for many centuries, it has went through many usage, like, a greater, like a movie theater, and other usage. And up to the point that now, okay, it's a Bass Depot. So that's, for me, the first connection. And it's this, among these first Africans, the first enslaved African to be brought to New York, they're the one who made what they call the Broadway. Because you have to think that, okay, Harlem at that time was it's a Dutch village. And the Dutch masters was asking, they wanted to have ways to what would be the arbor. So they asked slaves to clear the land to make, pathways to what would be downtown. And that, the slaves are the one who made what would be known now as Broadway living. Something much closer to us in history is the Back to Africa movement with Marcus Garvey, the Marcus Garvey Back to Africa movement. So here you have on your right, Marcus Garvey, and in the middle you have a Prince Kojo. I don't know how much you know about Prince Kojo. He's one of the first anti-colonial, he fought a lot against the French colonialism. So we're talking here about the 1920s. So he, a prince from Benin, and then, he was, in France here, worked as a lawyer, and then, he was invited to Harlem, to one of the convention of the UNIA by Marcus Garvey. And then you have the Harlem Renaissance. Obviously, the Harlem Renaissance, the one that almost everybody, speaks about and connects to. And the connection with Africa is that they laid the intellectual foundation for the first African intellectual. And here, and we can give the example of the negritude movement, Mrs. Senghor. Yeah, they laid, it's the, because you have to go back to history and think, okay, for the Harlem Renaissance is grew from the Negro movement. So it's the end of slavery. So you want a different image, to project different image. That's the Negro movement. And then, the Negro movement, grew into the Harlem Renaissance. And for the Africans fighting, fighting in the anti-colonial fight, they're looking for example that has already taken place in terms of intellectual construction. And the Harlem Renaissance gave them that intellectual, groundwork to build from. And then you have solidarity movement. Solidarity movements, here I'm referring to the 1960s. The 1960s, the encounters between the civil rights movement and what will be known as the third world, struggle for freedom. And that's, we have a lot of, we have a lot of connections. And within that space, this photo, it's about the East African airlift. I don't know how many of you heard about East African airlift. East African airlift happened between 1959 and 1961, when one trade union leader named Tom Mboya from Kenya went on a tour to the US asking for help from the US government, but also from the civil society to help train East African before they get independence, so that when East African countries get their independence, they will have the manpower to lead their own economic development. So he was able to get funding. He was able to, for the US government and also Canada also, to offer scholarship to East African students. I say East African student because it was 1959, so not all the countries were independent. So this is a photo taken in 1959, 1960, where Malcolm X was welcoming one of those East African airlift students coming to New York. And what we know is that among the East Africans, the East African airlift students, two that are very prominent. Huh? Kaunda, and if I say Obama, does it ring a bell? Yeah, the father of Obama. And also Wangari Maathai. Yeah, she's also was also part of the African airlift, East African airlift. So can you progress? And also one of the link and presence between the African presence in Harlem is the Harlem International Trade Center. It's a project that never came to fruition. Why? Let me take a few steps backward. First is we all know about the story of the World Trade Center. But the World Trade Center, Harlem leaders fought very hard to have it first built in Harlem. So that's, okay. And then, it didn't work out. So instead, what the governor Rockefeller, said, okay, what we're gonna do is, okay, we're going to give you resources to develop your neighborhood. You have to think in terms of the 60s and the 70s, the movement known as urban renewal, where to say things blankly, the US government simply wanted not, to push the militancy aside and focus on economy. So you have, the creation of, Rockefeller promised this building, which is the state building. It's an office. It's a 19-story building. So it promised to build that. So it was built, and also he promised to have. I'm blanking on this part. What was? So the office story building, and then there was an organization. I will come back to that. There is an organization that was put in place to develop the neighborhood, and one of the project was to put in place what we call the Harlem International Trade Center, so that Harlem may not have we didn't get the World Trade Center, but they wanted Harlem to be the entry point of a third world to the US. So this project was a 44-story building that was supposed to have hotel, education center, a center for learning African languages. And you have president like Obasanjo was, behind this project from Nigeria. So, but unfortunately, this is the space where it was supposed to be, but we have to go back to the context of the late 70s and 80s. We have the Cold War. And then, when the end of the Cold War, the project didn't get interest. And why also you have to think New York of the 1980s. New York of the 1980s, already you have a fiscal crisis that the city of New York suffered in the 70s. And then, Harlem in the 1980s, who want to build, could put, millions of dollars in Harlem at the time, because it was perceived as, this is more like a gang-ridden neighborhood with a lot of crime. So which means that developers were not interested to put their money in the neighborhood at the time. So the project never, came to fruition. But the idea itself for Harlem to be the center, the entry point for third world countries in the US in terms of economy, that's, signals that Harlem was, very important. Still is. Okay, so that was so, and then, okay, independence, and then we have a first wave of post-independence African mass migration to Harlem, because earlier I talked about mostly the second, wave. economic, but the first wave are mostly students, artists, diplomats, intellectuals, South African activists, Ethiopian refugees. Say that South African activists because when I was doing the research, I found there was an apartment in Harlem that they call the South African apartment, where the South African activists that kind of cycle through the apartment because, you know, fleeing persecution in their own country. Okay, the future of African immigrant communities in Harlem. Gentrification. This is, you know, very, you know, you have two views on gentrification. You have one view that all that it's the natural progress. It's an organic development of any space at one point. And then you have one view that this is a displacement land grab. Let's say this is more like capitalistic, you know, enterprise. So I don't know, you know, which side you are on, but either way, the effect for long-time residents is that, okay, they have to move. And I can give you, you know, like I said, I'm not sure that I will be able to afford living in Harlem for, you know, for a long time because the studio costs $2,000 and salaries are not rising as higher. And also I have some of my cast who no longer live in Harlem because I have, you know, when I came to Harlem, I did a web series on the African presence in Harlem. It's in French. So you Google it, you will see it, Aventure Africaine New York, you will see it. And the cast members were Burkinabé, who were actors in their own right in Burkina Faso, came to New York, and New York can be very brutal and make you anonymous. But wanted to go into cinema again. I'm like, I don't have that money, but I can do, you know, a web series where you play your own experience. And for the two actors who used to live in Harlem, first we moved to the Bronx, and then from the Bronx we moved to New Jersey. Yes. So that's why sometimes I'm like, oh, the idea that the Bronx is cheaper. No, the Bronx is no longer cheaper as you think it is. No. So, and also I'm asking in the book, I'm asking the question, are African immigrants the gentrifiers or the gentrified? Why? Because when we started moving in late 80s, you know, late 80s, the neighborhood was full of abandoned buildings. So we start moving in, then they create the demand. We're opening restaurants. And we open taxi companies that create the link between Harlem and Lower Manhattan. I say that because I interviewed one Senegalese electronics trader who told me up to 2000 when he will order electronics from Lower Manhattan to be delivered in Harlem so that he can send it to Senegal, the truck driver will say, no, I'm not coming to Harlem. To say that is, So, the work, by them moving in, they have contributed to make Harlem, I would say, attractive. But now it's a place where many of them cannot afford. So it's a very interesting question. Are they gentrified or are they gentrified? And then you have what I call the visiting mentality. Staying in America or going back home. That's the future of the, Harlem community because, and I think, I don't want to say it's pretty universal among diasporic communities, but you have this question where many will tell you that, okay, I'm just here to make money and I'm going back home. But the reality, 5 years, 10 years, 10, 15 years, 20 years, they're still there. So for me, it's kind of a delayed investment in the country, in your host country, but also delayed return that may never happen. And that plays a role in how sustainable a community you're trying to build. And also, if we talk about, I don't want to say, the second generation of the children, they will be coming into places where the parents haven't decided whether they're staying or not. And then will make a ripple effect where they will feel like they're starting from scratch. Emily, how am I doing on time? Okay, finished. Okay, right now, okay. So this one not going to play. These are videos that I embedded in the presentation where I was presenting the work to Harlem communities, and there were many takes on, what Harlem used to be and what is the African American experience and what African immigrants can learn from African Americans. So that's it. On that note, we stop here for question because I love part than me going through the material.
Do we have any questions in the room? Thank you so much, Boukary, also for that fantastic presentation. I think we all learned a lot from it. It was wonderful. Questions? Yes.
Hi. Thank you for the presentations. And actually, I lived there for over 3 years, past 3 years.
In Harlem?
In Harlem, and just next to City College.
City College.
So like I never actually know the stories behind that, like the market, the things, because I always in my area and with my community. And when I pass in that, I always very curious and like see they're dressing very beautiful dresses and the food. But I learned so much through this, and I was wondering what kind of inspired you to go this kind of a story, like finally start to kind of Harlem page, like start to undiscover this and to share this neighborhood to everybody through the African perspectives. And what is that kind of intuition, or why this time is time to tell this untold stories? Like how long, I believe you lived there for a long time, and how long you prepared and then say, now it's time to tell this, this story and let people to know this culture and everything. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's it, yeah, comment. Yeah, that was a comment. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I like the presentation too. Thank you so much. I'm socio-anthropologist and I work on the natural hair movement. So the hair salon parts interested me. I would like to know if you, through all your series, have you been able to document the impact on the natural hair movement impact on the area or in the salon, how maybe the business ideas changed when the women, African American or African, decided to adopt more natural practices or cosmetic?
Yeah, I address in the book, but not from the perspective that you're coming from, because for me, I address it in the book, but more from identity construction, where you have more and more millennial, you have the Gen Z generation that are, now moving into adopting natural hair in terms of, I call it, a reincarnation of Black pride that's happened in the 60s and 70s. So for me, I read it more in terms of, identity construction, because the challenge is for this, the children of immigrants, it is, how do you derive identity? Is it from your home, the parents, teaching you? Is it in schools? Is it you yourself going out on your own, doing it? So it's in that sense that I brought it in connection with global, cultural icon, and I gave example of Beyonce, having T-shirts, African-inspired songs and everything in that, context.
Yes, we have a question back here.
Yes, I actually have two questions. One is, you described your research methodology, but was there a research question? And if so, would you tell us what it was? And the second question is, given the research methodology, which seems to be more rooted in and the African storytelling, oral presentation, one would imagine that some of what was shared has to do with family life and the exchange of family tradition. So if in the course of your interviews, there was any insight around family dynamics and the ways in which they influence the other, would you say a bit about it?
So for my research question is simply, what is the 21st and 20th and 21st diasporic community building in America? I wanted to know it from the perspective of the newly arrived Black immigrants. Why? Because many of them came to America not having experienced the concept of Blackness or even race in the way Americans did. So for them, is the first time. So I was mostly interested in that, in that question. And you give me the opportunity, to move into, I'm finishing my next book, which is exactly a prolongation of this question, where I'm asking 2026, the US will be celebrating the 250-year anniversary of the Republic. And the question will be, who is included and excluded in the grand American narrative in history? It's kind of, the prolongation. Yeah, for the second question, yes, I did interviews a lot on 116 with Senegalese. And the family dynamics, like I said, first you have men who came as single, and then they brought their wives. And what is happening now? What is happening now? They call, for many family, they told me that the children lost what one person told me, the jom. I don't speak, Wolof, but jom told me means dignity, meaning that the children are not hardworking as they want them to be, which is kind of generational shift. And told me that's more something shared by the family. And I asked, how do you address that? And said that one of the things that's been going on, they have school, we have what they call the Quranic schools, Sundays and Thursday, and twice a week, is one of the way for them to instill values in the children in terms of family dynamic, where parents feel that they're respected, and that also they're instilling in the children, work ethics. Now, how is that effective? I cannot tell. But also, I remember, during the course of the interviews, one family person telling me, Boukary, you need to come back here at ASA. ASA is the American, American Association, Association of Senegalese in America. And the headquarters is on 116. I said, you have to come back here. With your book, we will be able to have a conversation with our children. So which means that, okay, I'm reading into it that there are dynamics in the family that are not being addressed.
Yes, we have a question right here.
Yes, I was born and I grew up in Harlem, and I also went to the City University. I want to know, at present, what are the boundaries of Harlem geographically?
I think, as of now, the boundaries, people always give 110 through 155, and then, okay, you have the two rivers on east and west. But I know, okay, that also doing the research that, I've been told that Harlem used to begin on 96th.
Okay. Also, my parents immigrated from the Caribbean, and they experienced a lot of hostility among the African Americans. And I wonder if that's true with the African immigrants. Hostility.
Yeah. Hostility, I would say this is kind of more like on personal basis, where in everyday, experience. I personally in my teaching, no. But I know from people, from friends in the community telling me the experience. But I'm pretty sure that on the other side too, they may have also, they say.
Mm-hmm. And as far as me personally, as far as identity goes, I think mine came through school, and I identify totally with being American.
So for you, through school, yeah.
We have time for one last question. Yes. Oh, we have 2 hands raised. Okay. All right, we have time for 2 last questions.
Hi, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. We met through LinkedIn, through Holy's Post. So I decided to come today. I
Thank
went to
you.
sports, and tonight friends plays, but I have to honor my brother.
Thank you.
You mentioned, you talked about Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, and also mentioned who he welcomed when they come to America. And today, as everybody knows, is the 30th anniversary of Malcolm X by Spike Lee. So I spoke to him this morning, actually. And I always wanted, from an African perspective, all that we know about how Malcolm X has influenced a lot of African leaders, like Kaunas Kaunas, Wangari Maathai, as you said, Barack Obama's father himself, because he was also in Harlem. We never had a book on his legacy from an African perspective, because back then when he went to
Egypt,
to the UN, to the AU, was to raise awareness about the situation of Black people in America, and it was really important that Africans also stood up. And as of today, as you are a writer, among your peers, do you have in plan a book of, like, his second name was Omutwale, that was given, and from African perspective, because we don't know much about that part. And that's one. And to follow up with her on the hair movement, and everybody knows that hair is a political statement for African women. And I think, without even seeing her face when Michelle Obama was leaving the White House, when I saw her hair, I said she's hungry. Because the hair is a political statement, and you see how her hair was when they were leaving the White House, right? And you can tell that she was not happy at all. She was happy to leave, but you can tell that she had a statement to make, because hair is very important. So that's the thing I wanted to add. And let's go back to Malcolm X's question.
Okay, so for Malcolm X question, it's a 2-pronged answer. The first one, I'm going to be, straightforward with this one, is even I know in New York, in the US, Malcolm has been, it's only within the last 10 years that Malcolm has become, someone people like to embrace publicly, or even, embrace publicly. Otherwise, less than 10 years, nobody want to touch Malcolm X so close. So I think that, okay, for African writers or scholars, I think they're still, tiptoeing, getting close to Malcolm X. So for me, it's that reason. The second reason, I say, point to a larger context, which is, for me, is the lack of substantive conversation between Africa and the diaspora. For me, that is lacking. We have cyclical example in the history where we come together. When I come together, I'm talking about the 60s or 70s. We come together and then we grow apart. I'm talking about And at the root of it, I'm saying at the root, but at least in one of it is the question of slavery. And how, I can tell that, okay, this is one that separate a lot of people, because you have what is the role of Africa in the slave trade? That question always, can come up, and that question is almost never addressed on the continent, but also, on the other side of the Atlantic. Because I'll give one last example. You have a New York Times Magazine that published the 1619 project before it becomes very, controversial and a lot of heat, because, the New York Times Magazine, the entire issue was 1690. And I got a copy, for historical record. But in that issue from, first page to last page, was no African voice. I'm saying no African. I'm not condemning, I'm just saying this is a fact. Which means, and also if you look on the other side of the Atlantic, talk about it in Africa, the 1619, except Ghana, that had the year of return, it was not, something mentioned on the continent. I'm just saying, giving this example, need, more substantive conversation need to happen. I don't know what is holding up. I just mentioned slavery, it could be something else. But once that substantive conversation is taking place, then I think as organically, yes, Malcolm X, coming to Egypt for the, African Union in a summit where he say, hey, what's African American are experiencing in the US, concern, Black people, concern you Africans.